The old petroglyphs in the canyon aren't depicting a hunt. They're depicting a harvest. Welcome to the Wilderness Protocol. We study the past to understand ourselves. We sift through the dust and bones, we decipher the faded markings on stone, and we construct narratives. Stories. We tell a story of our ancestors as mighty hunters, as survivors, as the masters of their domain. It is a comforting, heroic, and deeply human story. It is also, in some places, a profound lie. My name is Dr. Alistair Croft. I am an archaeologist specializing in North American petroglyphs. My life's work has been to read the stories that the old ones carved into the silent stone. But in a remote canyon in the Utah desert, I found a story that I was not meant to read. I went there seeking a record of humanity's resilience. I found instead a receipt for a transaction of cosmic horror. This is my report on the petroglyphs of Deep Creek Canyon. This is my testimony. They are not depicting a hunt. They are depicting a harvest. Deep Creek Canyon is not a place you stumble upon. It is a place you must actively seek, and even then it seems to resist being found. It's a deep, narrow, and brutally inaccessible scar in the heart of the Utah desert. A labyrinth of sheer rust-colored sandstone walls that have been scoured smooth by millennia of wind and flash floods. It is known to only a handful of researchers and to the descendants of the local Paiute tribe, the ones who call the canyon Anapui, the place of the story stone. For years I had considered the canyon the holy grail of Fremont-era rock art. The few grainy photographs that existed showed panels of breathtaking complexity and preservation. I had spent 2 years navigating the bureaucratic labyrinth of the Bureau of Land Management and petitioning the Paiute Tribal Council for a research permit. Finally, they had granted me one. A month. A single month to document what was considered to be one of the most significant and least understood collections of petroglyphs in North America. My team was small and specialized. There was Ben, a bright, fiercely ambitious graduate student whose doctoral thesis was dependent on this expedition. He was a master of photogrammetry, the science of creating 3D models from photographs. And there was our guide, a quiet, watchful Paiute elder named Joseph, a man whose face was a testament to the harsh beauty of the land itself. Joseph had been born in the shadow of this canyon, and he had agreed to lead us there on one very strict condition. "This is a place of power, Doctor," he had told me, his voice a low, gravelly rumble as we stood at the canyon's precipice, the wind whipping at our clothes. "A place of great history and great sorrow. The stories on the walls are not for everyone. You must look, but you must also listen to what the stones do not say." I, in my academic arrogance, nodded sagely. I thought I knew what he meant. The subtext, the cultural nuance, the spaces between the lines. I was an expert in interpretation. I was wrong. He was being literal. We established our small, self-sufficient base camp near the mouth of the canyon, in the shadow of a colossal, wind-scoured hoodoo that looked like a silent, hooded sentinel. For the first week, it was an archaeologist's paradise. The canyon walls were a vast, open-air library, its pages written in the universal language of carved stone. We found hundreds of petroglyphs, their dark, desert-varnished surfaces standing out in stark relief against the lighter sandstone. There were the familiar symbols, elegant, spiral suns, herds of graceful bighorn sheep, strange, shamanistic figures with elaborate, horned headdresses, their arms raised to the sky. And then we found the hunting scenes. They were magnificent. They were the reason I had come. Vast, complex panels, some stretching for 50 feet, depicting a primal and epic drama. On one side, there were the hunters' dozens of stick-figure men with strong, confident postures, holding bows and long, elegant spears. In the center, there were the herd's massive, powerful deer, elk, and bison, their bodies a chaotic, dynamic tangle of motion. "Look at this, Ben," I had said with awe on that third day, standing before the largest of the panels, a masterpiece we nicknamed The Great Hunt. "Look at the artistry, the understanding of motion, the sheer narrative power. This isn't just a picture. It's an epic poem in stone." Ben was ecstatic, his camera clicking away, capturing thousands of images for his 3D models. "This is it, Dr. Croft," he'd said, his eyes shining with ambition. "This will be the cornerstone of my thesis. The Fremont culture as the ultimate apex predator. The masters of this domain. This panel proves it." We saw what we wanted to see. We saw what every textbook, every museum exhibit had trained us to see. A celebration of the hunt. The story of man's courage and skill, his triumph over the powerful beasts of the wild. It was the foundational myth of humanity. And it was right here, carved in stone. It was Joseph who first planted the seed of doubt. He never joined us at the rock faces. He would stay back at the camp, or sit on a high ledge, watching us work, his arms crossed, his dark eyes holding a strange, unreadable, and deeply sorrowful expression. One evening as we sat by our small fire, the immense, star-dusted silence of the desert pressing in on us, he finally spoke. "You read the pictures, Doctor," he said, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "But you do not see the story." "What do you mean, Joseph?" I asked a little defensively. "It's one of the most detailed hunting narratives I've ever seen. It's a celebration of these people's way of life." He shook his head slowly, a gesture of immense, weary patience. "You see the men with spears," he said. "You see the running animals. But you do not see what the animals are running from." His words were a pebble tossed into the still pool of my academic certainty. The ripple spread through the night. The next morning I went back to the Great Hunt panel alone. I left Ben at the camp, processing his photos. I needed to look at it with new eyes. I stood before the massive, sun-drenched tableau, and I tried to see what Joseph had seen. I forced myself to abandon my preconceived notions, to unlearn a lifetime of academic interpretation. And I saw it. Joseph was right. The hunters were there, on the left side of the panel, their spears held ready. The great herds of deer and bison were in the center, a maelstrom of carved, panicked motion. But their panic, it was not directed at the hunters. Their stylized heads were turned, their bodies contorted in fear, not towards the men with spears, but away from them. They were running past the hunters. And their flight was directed towards something else, something on the far right of the panel. There, at the culmination of the scene, was a single, large, and deeply strange figure. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and spidery. And it had no face. The head was a smooth, blank, and terrifyingly empty oval. From its back, or perhaps its shoulders, a series of long, whip-like tendrils or rays erupted, reaching out towards the fleeing animals, almost as if to welcome them. And the hunters, I looked at them again. They were not in attack postures. They were not throwing their spears. They were standing still. Their spears were not raised in aggression, but held low, almost in an attitude of presentation, of offering. They were a line of silent, dutiful sentinels. They were not hunting the animals. They were herding them. They were driving them, a living, terrified sacrifice, towards the strange, faceless, star-fingered god at the end of the line. "It's not a hunt," I whispered to the silent canyon, the words of profanity against my entire career. "It's a sacrifice. It's a harvest." That single, terrifying realization was the first crack in the foundation of my world. The story I had been telling myself, the story my entire profession had been telling, was a lie. These people were not masters. They were servants. They were farmers. And the crop they were tending was fear. But the discovery that shattered my worldview completely came a few days later. As we pushed deeper into the canyon, into a section the Paiute called the Sky Teller's Alcove. It was here we found a different, and even more baffling, kind of petroglyph. These were not scenes of animals or hunts. They were astronomical charts. Carved into a smooth, dark, and sheltered wall protected from the elements for 1,000 years, was a series of complex, celestial maps. I was stunned by their sophistication. There were clear, unmistakable spirals that could only be representations of galaxies. There were clusters of carved dots that perfectly matched the positions of the stars in the Pleiades cluster. These ancient, pre-agricultural people had possessed a sophisticated and deeply puzzling understanding of the cosmos. But one map, the largest and most detailed, was wrong. It clearly depicted our solar system. There was the sun, a large rayed circle at the center. There were the small inner planets. There was the great ring giant of Saturn. It was all there. But it showed a planet beyond the orbit of Neptune. A ninth planet. And its orbit was strange, highly elliptical, and steeply inclined to the rest of the solar system. It was a perfect 1,000-year-old depiction of the theoretical, undiscovered Planet 9 that modern astronomers were only now, with their most powerful computers and telescopes, beginning to hypothesize even existed. This is impossible, Ben breathed, his hand hovering over the cool stone, as if afraid to touch it. How could they have known? They didn't have telescopes. They couldn't have seen it. Maybe they didn't need to, Joseph's quiet, steady voice said from behind us. He had followed us for the first time to one of the rock art sites. Maybe it came to them. He raised a long, weathered finger and pointed to another section of the celestial map. There was the ninth planet carved deep into the stone, and next to it was another symbol. A single, stylized, open hand. And from the planet, a thin, faint line was drawn, connecting it to the waiting, open hand. It was a depiction of contact, an offering, or an invitation. And then I saw the final terrible detail. A detail so small, so easy to overlook, that my heart nearly stopped when I registered it. The hand. The stylized human hand in the drawing, it was anatomically perfect in every way, except for one. It had a small but distinct and unmistakable sixth finger. The discovery of the celestial map and the six-fingered hand left us in a state of stunned intellectual shock. We spent the rest of the day in a frantic haze of documentation. Ben took hundreds of high-resolution photos, his hands moving with a feverish energy. I made precise sketches, my scientific mind trying to impose order and reason on an impossible reality. How could a pre-Columbian culture have known the precise, theoretical orbit of a planet that modern science had only just begun to suspect? How could the specific anomalous six-fingered polydactyly, a mutation I'd seen referenced in other strange protocol files from across the continent, appear here 1,000 years in the past? Joseph, our guide, remained silent. He watched us work, his face a mask of grim, sorrowful resignation. He looked like a man watching a doctor explain a terminal diagnosis he had known about his entire life. He offered no explanations. He just watched. That night, the atmosphere in our small camp was thick with a new unspoken tension. The usual campfire chatter was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. We were three scientists who had just come face to face with a data point that broke every model we had. We were adrift in a sea of impossibility. It was Ben who finally broke the silence. "It has to be a coincidence," he said, more to convince himself than us. "The Planet 9 depiction, the six-fingered hand, it's pareidolia. We're seeing patterns that aren't there because we're looking for them. We're projecting modern myths onto ancient art." I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe him. But the precision of the orbital map, the specificity of the six-fingered hand, it was too much to be a coincidence. "And what about the Great Hunt?" I asked, my voice low. "Is that pareidolia too? Or is it exactly what it looks like, a tribute?" Before Ben could answer, Joseph stood up. His gaze was not on us but on the canyon walls, which were now just dark, looming shapes in the moonlight. "The moon is at its apex," he whispered. "It is time. He has returned." "Who has returned?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. "The sky taker," Joseph said, his voice a low, reverent whisper. "The great herder. He has come for the tithe." As the words left his mouth, the humming began. It was not a sound we heard with our ears, not at first. It was a feeling. A low, deep, and rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the canyon itself. It resonated in our chests and our bones. It was the sound of a great and ancient machine, dormant for centuries, slowly powering on. And then the canyon walls began to glow. It was a faint, internal, phosphorescent light, a sickly, green-white luminescence that seemed to be coming from within the rock itself. And the petroglyphs, the images that had been inert and unchanging for 1,000 years, began to move. We scrambled to our feet and stared, our minds refusing to process what our eyes were seeing. On the Great Hunt panel, the carved lines of light were now shimmering, shifting. The stick figure hunters were visibly trembling, their spears shaking. The great herds of deer and bison were now a frantic, chaotic vortex of motion, their carved forms running in panicked, silent loops. And the tall, faceless figure on the right, the herder, the sky taker, its form now glowing with a brighter, more malevolent light, began to slowly, deliberately raise its long, thin arms. "This is impossible," Ben breathed, his scientific skepticism dissolving into pure, unadulterated terror. "The stone is behaving like a high-resolution display screen. It's a recording." "It is not a recording," Joseph corrected, his voice full of a terrible, ancient awe. "It is a reflection. The stone remembers. And it is showing us what is happening now." He raised a trembling, weathered finger and pointed down the canyon, into the deep darkness of the dry creek bed. "There," he said. I looked, and I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that it was just the strange shifting shadows cast by the glowing petroglyphs. But they were moving. A vast, silent herd of desert bighorn sheep. There must have been hundreds of them. They were not grazing. They were not resting. They were moving in a tight, panicked herd down the canyon, their forms dark and spectral in the eerie green light. They were being driven by an unseen force. And then behind them the herders appeared. They were not human. They were the figures from the petroglyphs brought to life. They were tall, impossibly thin, their bodies seeming to shift and flicker between a solid, physical form and a being of pure, dark shadow. They had no faces, just smooth, blank ovals that seemed to absorb the faint light, leaving a void where a face should be. They moved with a silent, gliding grace, their long arms guiding the herd, keeping them moving, keeping them contained, their movements a perfect echo of the glowing figures on the rock wall beside us. And they were not alone. Walking among them were the animals' own echoes. I saw a bighorn sheep that was slightly translucent, its form shimmering like a heat haze. I saw another that seemed to be made of pure, black shadow, a hole in the shape of a sheep. The living and the dead, the real and the echo, were being herded together in a single, terrifying procession. We were crouched behind a large boulder. Hidden in the shadows, 3 modern scientists watching a silent, terrifying, and sacred procession from 1,000 years ago come to life. "What do we do?" Ben whispered, his voice cracking with a fear that was beyond anything he had ever known. "We do nothing," Joseph said, his voice as firm and as solid as the stone that sheltered us. "We do not interfere. We are not a part of this story. We are merely witnesses. To make a sound to be seen would be to be added to the herd." The great herd of sheep, both living and spectral, flowed past our hiding place like a river of silent, panicked life. And as the last of them passed, we saw what was driving them. It was the Great One, the Sky Taker, the figure from the end of the petroglyph. It was a being of immense size, at least 15 feet tall, its form a chaotic, shifting mass of shadow and flickering green light. It seemed to have no solid shape, its outline constantly resolving and dissolving. Long, whip-like tendrils of pure darkness radiated from its back, gently, almost lovingly, caressing the flanks of the last few sheep, keeping them moving. Its faceless head, a smooth, glowing oval, was tilted towards the sky, towards the dark patch in the heavens where its home, the 9th planet, now resided. It was the shepherd of this harvest. And it was a sight so alien, so fundamentally wrong, that my mind could barely contain it. It was like looking at a tear in the fabric of reality itself. The entire procession moved down the canyon and disappeared around a sharp bend in the rock. The humming from the stones began to subside. The glowing of the petroglyphs began to fade. We waited, huddled in the darkness, not daring to breathe, for a long, long time. Finally, Joseph stood up, his legs unsteady. "It is over," he said. "The offering has been made. For tonight." "The tithe," I whispered, the word from Joseph's earlier warning now making a horrifying kind of sense. "The payment. This happens every time that thing is in the sky." Joseph nodded grimly. In the time of my ancestors, they understood the covenant. When the dark star, the sky-taker's eye, returned, a payment had to be made. A tithe of life of spirit to the silent gods who lived there. They would offer a portion of the great herds. A sacrifice to keep the gods appeased. To keep them from harvesting the most valuable prey of all. And what's that? Ben asked, though his white, terrified face told me he already knew the answer. Joseph's dark eyes met mine, and in them I saw a sorrow that spanned 1,000 years. Us? The rest of the night passed in a state of terrified wakefulness. We did not speak. There were no words to describe what we had seen. The hole in the sky remained, a silent, black wound in the heavens, a constant reminder of the alien god that was watching us. As dawn approached, a new and final phenomenon began. From the black void above, a single, impossibly thin and spider-like filament of pure darkness began to descend. It was a line being lowered from the dark planet, a cosmic fishing line, down to the canyon floor. It touched the ground at the very spot where the herd had disappeared. And then it began to retract, pulling something up with it. It was a stream of faint, shimmering and ethereal lights. Thousands of them, like a river of fireflies in the twilight. They were the life force, the spirits, the souls of the harvested sheep, being drawn up from the earth, a river of pale, ghostly light, into the hungry, waiting darkness of the 9th planet. We watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the last of the lights was consumed by the void. The dark filament retracted. And then the hole in the sky began to shrink. The familiar, comforting stars of our own galaxy reappeared, one by one, like lights being switched back on in a house that had been dark for too long. Within minutes, the sky was normal again. A beautiful, familiar, and star-filled desert sky. The humming from the rocks ceased. The glowing of the petroglyphs faded completely, becoming once more just inert, ancient carvings on stone. The event was over. The tithe had been collected. The gods were satisfied. For now. The dawn that followed the harvest was a thing of obscene, offensive beauty. The sun rose, painting the sheer sandstone cliffs in breathtaking shades of gold and rose. The air was clean and still. The sky was a perfect, cloudless and completely normal cerulean blue. The hole in the sky was gone. The silent, humming pressure was gone. The world had, on its surface, returned to normal. But it was a lie. We knew it was a lie. The normality felt like a mask, a thin, fragile veneer stretched over a reality of cosmic and different horror. We, the three of us, were the only ones in the world who had seen the mask slip. We should have left then. We should have packed our gear, hiked out of that cursed canyon and never looked back. The rational, self-preserving part of my brain was screaming at me to do just that. But the scientist in me, the arrogant, foolish, and terminally curious part, refused. We had just witnessed the single most important event in human history. A verifiable interaction with an extraterrestrial, or perhaps extra-dimensional intelligence. We had seen a god walk the earth and take its tithe. To leave without documenting the aftermath felt like a betrayal of my entire life's work. We need proof, Ben said, his voice a hoarse whisper. The terror of the night was still etched on his face, but it was now overlaid with a manic, obsessive, scientific excitement. Photos of the canyon now. Soil samples. Radiation readings. We have to document the aftermath. We have to show them. We have to make them believe us. I looked at Joseph. He had not slept. He had spent the entire night sitting, facing the canyon, a silent, grim sentinel. He looked at us, his dark eyes full of a deep, ancient pity. The story is over, doctors, he said, his voice a low rumble. You should leave it be. The gods are satisfied. Let them sleep. This isn't about gods, Joseph, I said, with a confidence I did not feel. This is about science. About knowledge. He just shook his head slowly. There is no knowledge here, he said. Only a story that is better left unread. You have witnessed the harvest. Do not stay to see what grows in the empty field. But we didn't listen. We were men of science. We were driven by a foolish human need to understand, to categorize, to put this unimaginable horror into a neat little box that our textbooks could contain. We walked back down into the canyon, back to the site of the petroglyph panels. The air was still and quiet. There was no sign of the massive herd of sheep. No tracks. No droppings. No trace at all. It was as if they had simply been erased from existence. We returned to the Great Hunt panel, the massive 50-foot-long tableau. And what we saw made the blood freeze in our veins. The petroglyph had changed. The night before it had been a scene of frantic, panicked motion. Now it was a scene of placid, triumphant stillness. The great herds were gone. The faceless, shadowy herders were gone. The colossal, terrifying form of the sky-taker was gone. The entire, vast tableau had been wiped clean. All that remained were the images of the small, stick-figure hunters. They were no longer standing in a passive line. They were now holding their spears up in an attitude of victory. And at their feet were the stylized, carved images of the dead sheep, a neat and tidy record of a successful hunt. It's rewritten itself, Ben stammered, his camera dangling forgotten from his hand. It's changed the past. No, I corrected, my voice a whisper. It hasn't changed the past. It's changed the record of the past. It's a self-correcting lie. It's hiding the truth in plain sight. The story was now, once again, a simple heroic tale of a hunt. The harvest, the faceless gods, the hole in the sky, all of it had been erased, leaving behind a palatable, understandable myth for the next generation of archaeologists to discover. It was a lie written in stone, to hide a truth that was too terrible for the human mind to bear. And then I saw the other change. A change that was far more personal and far more terrifying. I ran to the other panel, the one with the celestial map. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. The solar system was still there. The sun, the planets, the rings of Saturn. And the ninth planet, the dark star, was still there in its strange, elliptical orbit. But the hand, the beckoning, six-fingered hand, was gone. In its place, carved into the stone with fresh, sharp edges that still showed the light-colored rock beneath, was a new symbol. It was a drawing of a human stick figure, just like the hunters. But this one was not holding a spear. It was holding a small rectangular object, Ben's camera. And it was standing next to a detailed and perfectly rendered drawing of a modern four-wheel drive truck. Our truck, the one that was at that very moment parked at the canyon's rim. I felt a wave of vertigo so intense I had to put a hand on the canyon wall to steady myself. The petroglyph was no longer just a record. It was no longer just a reflection of the present. It was now interactive. It had seen us. It had seen our technology. And it had incorporated us into its 1,000-year-old story. Joseph, I choked out, my voice trembling. What does this mean? Joseph, who had followed us, looked at the new carving, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in his ancient, wise eyes. It means the story is changing, he said, his voice a grim whisper. The old tithe was of animals, a tribute of life from the land. But you are new. You are different. You are loud. Your machines, your cameras, your radios that speak to the sky. You have made a new sound in this quiet place. And you have drawn its attention. He pointed a trembling finger at the stick figure holding the camera. It is no longer satisfied with the souls of sheep, he whispered. It is curious. It now wants a new kind of harvest. It now wants the souls of the storytellers. It was then that Ben started screaming. He was standing further down the canyon, his back pressed against the rock wall, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending terror. He was pointing at another panel of rock, a panel that I swear had been blank the day before. We ran over to him. It was a new petroglyph, freshly carved. The edges of the lines were so sharp they looked like they could cut you. It depicted 3 stick figures. 2 were standing. 1 was lying on the ground. And standing over the fallen figure was one of the tall, faceless herders. And it was holding in its long, thin, spidery fingers a single, stylized human hand. The hand it had just taken from the fallen figure. And then I saw the final soul-shattering detail. The two standing figures, one was tall and thin. That was me. The other was shorter, broader. That was Joseph. And the figure on the ground, the one that was now missing a hand, it had a small, stylized, and unmistakable beard. It was a drawing of us. It was a drawing of me, Joseph, and Ben. And it was a prophecy. A depiction of a future event. Our future. The story of our own, personal, and imminent harvest. We have to get out. I choked out, my voice no longer my own. Now. We turned and ran, a mindless, panicked flight from our own rock-carved destiny. We ran back towards our base camp. But our camp was gone. The tents, the sleeping bags, our packs, our scientific equipment. All of it had vanished. The ground was swept clean as if we had never been there. All except for 3 objects. They were placed neatly in the center of the clearing where our fire had been, arranged in a small triangular pattern. My leather-bound field journal, Ben's expensive digital camera, and Joseph's handcrafted, beaded medicine pouch. They were offerings. Our offerings. The things that held our stories, our ambitions, our faith. We were being told, in the silent, terrifying language of this place, that we were no longer visitors. We were no longer witnesses. We were now part of the herd. The next tithe. We didn't take them. We didn't touch them. We just ran. We ran from the canyon, from the humming rocks, from the impossible sky, from our own foretold future on the canyon walls. We ran until the silence of the desert was replaced by the sound of our own, ragged, terrified breathing. We were found by a group of tourists 2 days later, wandering deliriously on a highway miles from the park's entrance. We were dehydrated, sunburnt, and incoherent. We tried to tell them our story. We tried to tell the park rangers, the police, the doctors. They listened with the patient, pitying smiles of those who are dealing with the mentally unwell. They spoke of shared hallucinations, of heatstroke, of the tricks the desert can play on the mind. Ben's thesis was rejected, his career over before it began. He suffers from a profound, debilitating astrophobia, fear of stars, and can no longer bear to be outside at night. Joseph returned to his reservation, a quiet, haunted man who will no longer walk the canyons of his ancestors. He just sits on his porch and he waits. And me? I live a quiet life now. I am no longer an archaeologist. I cannot bear to look at the stories of the past. I know that they are incomplete. I know that the most important and most terrible parts have been erased. But sometimes on clear, dark nights I look up at the constellation Serpens. And I see it. A tiny, almost imperceptible patch of black, a single missing star. A hole in the sky. A reminder that the sky taker is still there. Watching. Waiting. And I know that the harvest is not over. The tithe has only been postponed. The God of that place is patient. It has waited for 1,000 years. It can wait a little longer. And I know that somewhere in a deep, silent canyon in the Utah desert, there is a story carved in stone. A story of 3 men who saw too much. Prophecy. And it is waiting patiently for its final terrible chapter to be written. The chapter with the empty hand. Thank you for completing this archaeological report from the Wilderness Protocol. History is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is written by the survivors. And sometimes the story it tells is not about the glory of the hunt, but about the quiet, patient, and terrible efficiency of the harvest. If this record has served as a necessary warning, please consider liking this video and subscribing for further declassifications. Be careful of the stories you read in stone. They may not be as old as you think. And you may find yourself written into the next chapter.